June 30th, 1934. Bad VC. Before sunrise, SS men storm a hotel. Minutes later, SA leader Edmund Heines lies dead on the floor. Officially, treason and debauchery. In reality, a power grab that broke the SA and handed power to the SS. Who was Heines? How did he become so feared? And why did he have to disappear? Edmund Heines was born on July 21, 1897, in Munich. His mother, Helene Martha Heines, worked as a maid. His father, Lieutenant Edmund von Parisch, came from a wealthy Hamburg merchant family. But von Parisch never married her. Edmund grew up as an illegitimate child, a stain that carried heavy weight in early 20th century Germany. In a city of strict social order, that label followed him everywhere. Neighbors whispered, teachers looked down on him. He learned early that respect was earned not by birth, but by force. That hunger for recognition would later define him. At school, he wasn't particularly academic. He was restless, easily angered, drawn to fights. By the time war broke out in 1914, Heines was only 17. To him, the war sounded like escape, an adventure where a man could prove his worth with courage, not family name. In 1915, he volunteered for the German army and was sent to the Western Front. The trenches of France were a world of mud, gas, and death, but to Heines, they offered something he never had before: purpose and belonging. He fought with the 11th Bavarian Infantry Regiment and quickly earned a reputation for recklessness. He was wounded several times, yet he always returned to the line. That stubborn endurance earned him medals, the Iron Cross First and Second Class, and eventually the rank of Reserve Lieutenant. For the first time, people saluted him instead of judging him. But the glory didn't last. When Germany lost the war in 1918, the empire that had given him a name collapsed overnight. Soldiers came home to a country in chaos. There were food shortages, riots, and revolution. The Kaiser fled. The army disbanded. For men like Heines, who knew only command and obedience, peace felt worse than defeat. He returned to Munich, bitter and disillusioned. The medals pinned to his chest meant nothing. Civilians saw soldiers not as heroes, but as reminders of failure. Germany was now a republic run by politicians he despised. Heines had traded one battlefield for another, this time a political one. As the city turned into a playground for revolutionaries and extremists, Heines began to look for a new fight. Somewhere he could channel the rage left over from the war. And in the streets of post-war Munich, he was about to find it. The war had ended, but peace never came. Streets were filled with hungry veterans, political riots, and red flags waving over government buildings. Germany had lost an empire, and no one knew what would replace it. For men like Edmund Heines, once proud officers, the silence after battle felt unbearable. The war had taken everything: comrades, purpose, and the illusion of control. He needed another fight. He found it in the Freikorps Roßbach, one of many paramilitary units made of ex-soldiers who refused to accept defeat. They called themselves patriots, but their methods were closer to gangs than armies. They carried rifles, hunted communists, and shot traitors in the name of order. In truth, the Freikorps were the shadow army of a broken nation, violent, angry, and waiting for direction. Heines thrived there. He was young, disciplined, and unafraid of blood. Fellow members described him as calm under fire, quick to command, and fiercely loyal to his men. When others hesitated, he acted. That decisiveness made him valuable, especially in street battles that turned Munich into a war zone once again. By 1920, his unit took part in the Kapp-Putsch, an attempted right-wing coup against the Weimar Republic. For 3 tense days, Freikorps soldiers marched through Berlin, hoping to restore the old monarchy. But the coup fell apart when workers went on strike, and the regular army refused to help. It was another humiliation, another collapse. Yet Heines didn't lose faith. He learned. Power didn't lie in politics or parliaments. It lay in force, fear, and whoever could control the streets. When the Freikorps disbanded, Heines followed his commander, Gerhard Roßbach, into underground nationalist circles. These groups blended soldier culture with new political movements, and one of them, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, was just beginning to rise. The Nazis needed fighters, not talkers, and Heines fit perfectly. He brought discipline, violence, and the aura of a battlefield survivor. When the SA, the Sturmabteilung, or Storm Detachment, formed as the Nazi Party's private army, Heines was among the first to join. In the chaos of post-war Germany, he finally found what he'd been searching for, a cause that promised revenge, purpose, and order through violence. But with new power came darker ambitions, and soon Heines would become one of the most feared men in the Nazi street wars. By the summer of 1920, Germany was a land of secret plots and whispered betrayals. Paramilitary groups like the Freikorps still hid weapons from the Allies, burying them in forests and barns across Bavaria. Every rifle mattered. Every leak could destroy them. When rumors spread that a young man named Willi Schmidt had informed the authorities about one of these caches, the men in Heines's unit decided someone had to pay. It was July, near Breslau. Schmidt was lured out to a wooded area by men he thought were friends. He was accused of treason, beaten until he could barely stand, then shot point blank. His body was left among the trees, a warning to anyone who talked. This kind of killing had a name. Femme-Mord. Femme-Murder. Extrajudicial executions carried out by nationalist groups claiming to defend Germany's honor. They saw themselves as patriots, cleaning the nation of traitors. But in truth, it was mob justice. And Edmund Heines was right in the middle of it. When investigators found the body, whispers led back to Heines and his comrades. The Weimar police, struggling to control the chaos, launched an inquiry. Witnesses described secret meetings, coded letters, and the names of those involved. For the first time, Heines was facing the real possibility of prison, or worse. But post-war Germany was fragile. Courts were overwhelmed, evidence went missing, and nationalist judges often sympathized with men who claimed to be fighting for the fatherland. Heines was briefly arrested, questioned, and then released. The case faded into the noise of political violence that swept across Germany in those years. Dozens of other Femme-Mord followed, often committed by the same networks of Freikorps veterans. For Heines, it was a turning point. He had crossed from soldier to killer and gotten away with it. The act didn't just harden him, it gave him a sense of impunity. Violence had become a language he spoke fluently. In those same years, a new movement began to echo the same rage that drove the Freikorps, the Nazi Party. Its rallies promised revenge for the humiliation of Versailles, the restoration of German pride, and the destruction of internal enemies. It was everything Heines already believed, now with uniforms, slogans, and a leader who demanded loyalty. By 1922, he had joined the early Nazi movement, working closely with Gerhard Roßbach to organize the SA, the brown-shirted street militia that attacked communists, Jews, and political rivals. For Heines, it was a new home built on familiar violence. He was no longer an outlaw. He was part of something official, something bigger. The lines between soldier, executioner, and political enforcer blurred completely. And behind his calm, disciplined face, a reputation began to form, of a man who would torture without hesitation, and who seemed to enjoy it. But even as his power grew, the ghosts of that forest murder in 1920 followed him. And soon, those same instincts would draw him closer to another ruthless man. In December 1922, Edmund Heines officially joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, becoming member number 78. It was still a small fringe movement then, meeting in beer halls and marching with borrowed flags. But to Heines, it felt like home. The party's fiery speeches about betrayal, revenge, and national rebirth spoke directly to men like him, disillusioned soldiers who had lost both a war and a sense of purpose. Heines brought more than just belief. He brought muscle. His old Freikorps contacts, men who had spent years in the shadows of post-war violence, followed him into the SA, the Nazi Party's new paramilitary force known as the Sturmabteilung, or Storm Detachment. These were the so-called brown shirts, brawlers who fought street battles with communists, broke up rival rallies, and intimidated political opponents. Their violence was no longer rogue. It was now wrapped in a flag. Through these circles, Heines met Ernst Röhm, one of the party's earliest and most dangerous figures. Röhm, a former army officer, understood the value of men like Heines, soldiers who had learned to kill without hesitation. Röhm believed that the SA was the true army of the new Germany, and he saw in Heines not just loyalty, but brutality that could be directed and refined. Heines rose quickly under Röhm's mentorship. His reputation from the Freikorps years, the beatings, the executions, the fear he inspired, became a kind of currency. By early 1923, he was organizing local SA units in Breslau and Silesia, commanding men who idolized him as a warrior from the trenches. That same year, Hitler and Röhm attempted their first grab for power, the beer hall putsch in Munich. Heines was among those who took part, marching with hundreds of brown shirts through the city streets, believing the army would join them in overthrowing the Weimar government. But the coup collapsed in hours. Police opened fire, killing several marchers. Hitler was arrested. The party was banned. Heines, too, was briefly jailed, his name appearing in local police records as part of the illegal Nazi movement. But when the party reformed in 1925, Heines returned without hesitation. He had seen what the movement could become, and he knew it needed men who wouldn't flinch. The years that followed hardened him even more. The streets of Weimar Germany became battlegrounds, communists versus nationalists, SA versus Red Front fighters. Heines thrived in that chaos, leading assaults, breaking strikes, and running makeshift prisons for political enemies. In Silesia, people whispered that his name alone could silence a crowd. He had turned violence into a career. Politics was just another kind of war, and in that war, he was a rising officer. But as Heines's power grew, so did the shadows of his past. Police files, old witnesses, and long-forgotten testimonies began to resurface. The question was no longer whether Heines could outrun his history. It was how much blood he would spill before it caught up to him. After years of slipping through the cracks, Edmund Heines finally ran out of luck. The murder he had committed back in 1920, the killing of Willy Schmidt in a lonely Silesian forest, was no longer buried under silence. In early 1928, a new wave of investigation swept through old Freikorps networks. Former comrades began to talk, and forgotten reports resurfaced. The name Heines appeared again and again, linked to brutality that even other veterans found hard to excuse. On January 22, 1928, police arrived in Schongau to arrest him. By then, Heines was no longer a drifting ex-soldier. He was a rising political figure with friends in the Nazi Party and the paramilitary SA. The arrest sent a jolt through his circle. For nationalists, it felt like an insult to the memory of those who had fought in the streets after the war. For the fragile Weimar government, it was a chance to prove that even men with medals and uniforms could be brought to justice. The trial took place in Stettin, a port city far from Munich's beer halls, but filled with reporters and tension. The prosecution accused Heines of organizing and carrying out the Femimord, a secret execution under the guise of nationalist justice. They argued that Schmidt had been suspected of betrayal, taken into the woods, beaten savagely, and shot dead. His body had been found days later, half buried under the trees. The courtroom atmosphere was electric. Veterans in worn uniforms filled the benches, glaring at the prosecutors. Heines sat calmly, his face unreadable. He didn't deny being present that day, only that it was murder. His lawyer painted him as a patriot, someone who had acted in the chaos of post-war Germany to protect his comrades. It was a story many wanted to believe. When the verdict finally came, the outcome was neither victory nor defeat. The court convicted Heines of manslaughter, not murder, and sentenced him to 15 years. But the Weimar Republic's justice system was already faltering. His sentence was reduced to 5 years, and barely a year later, on May 14, 1929, Heines was free again after paying bail of 5,000 Reichsmarks, a sum quickly raised by Nazi sympathizers. To the public, it looked like a loophole. To Heines, it felt like validation. He had learned something essential. Power could protect him. The press in nationalist circles even turned him into a symbol of strength, a man who suffered for Germany's cause. The message was clear. Violence, if done under the right banner, was no longer a crime. When he walked out of prison, he wasn't the same man who went in. He was harder, angrier, and more connected than ever. The courtroom had failed to contain him, and the streets were waiting. The question now was how far he would go with his second chance, and what kind of power he would build with it. After stepping out of Stettin in 1929, Heines wasted no time. By 1930, he had parlayed his notoriety into politics, winning a seat in the Reichstag for the Nazi Party. His constituents weren't looking for policy papers or speeches. They wanted action, and Heines delivered. He brought the same raw aggression from the streets and Freikorps days into the halls of power. Reports from the time describe him as a brawler among politicians, ready to throw fists as easily as words. Colleagues later recalled him swaggering through corridors, a mix of charm and menace, making enemies with a single glare. By August 1932, his reputation for violence became impossible to ignore. In the Reichstag Café, Heines and a few loyal SA men assaulted Helmut Klotz, a former Nazi turned critic. Punches were thrown, chairs overturned, and the café erupted into chaos. Witnesses described stunned deputies frozen in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or flee. Newspapers covering the incident framed it as part of the larger struggle of the Nazi rise, blurring the lines between politics and street warfare. Heines had proven that the same man who once dragged a suspected traitor into the woods could now attack someone under the eyes of the state. His election and publicized actions also sent a message to Nazi rivals and traditional elites. The SA, under Ernst Röhm's leadership, was growing restless, demanding recognition, pay, and influence. Men like Heines represented the new order, violent, loyal, and untouchable. They challenged the old conservative politicians who were uncomfortable with the open use of force in political settings. Every brawl, every confrontation cemented the idea that law and order were now tools, to be wielded selectively, depending on loyalty and ideology. Yet, power brings its own dangers. As Heines climbed, he attracted enemies within the party itself. Some SA men were ambitious, others suspicious of his growing influence. Traditional conservative elements, including Reichswehr officers and industrial leaders, began whispering about the threat of a paramilitary force shadowing the government. Even among Nazis, the flamboyant, aggressive style of Heines created friction, with many worried that his antics could tarnish the party's public image or provoke retaliation from opponents. Still, Heines thrived in this chaos. He had survived murder investigations, imprisonment, and public scrutiny. Each challenge had hardened him, teaching him which battles to fight openly and which to stage quietly behind the scenes. His eyes were always fixed on the next opportunity, the next street fight, the next consolidation of power. By 1931, the SA was no longer just a street army. It was a swirling mix of loyalty, ambition, and scandal. In Berlin, Walter Stennes, an SA leader, staged a rebellion against the party, citing loyalty concerns and accusing Ernst Röhm and his inner circle of being notorious homosexuals, including references to male prostitutes, or Puppenjungen as they were called in whispers. Heines, already infamous for his violent prowess, was pulled into the center of this murky storm. Internal memos and party gossip identified him as part of Röhm's close circle, someone who lived both in the public eye and in hidden, forbidden worlds. For Nazis, homosexuality was officially criminal under paragraph 175, punishable by imprisonment, or worse. Yet high-ranking members like Röhm and Heines were shielded, at least temporarily, because of their usefulness. Their private lives were leveraged silently. Enemies whispered it to sow distrust, while allies ignored it as long as orders were carried out. It was a precarious balancing act, where power could shield sin, but only for so long. Heines's reputation for brutality helped maintain that balance. He was feared enough that few dared publicly challenge him directly. Despite the danger, he maintained his influence, moving seamlessly between the SA barracks and political functions. He attended rallies, oversaw SA operations, and ensured the men under him remained disciplined or terrorized into loyalty. Reports from the period describe him patrolling streets with iron will, personally enforcing rules, and at times physically punishing those who defied him. Those who survived his wrath spoke of the man as cold, calculating, and relentless, a figure who understood fear as a tool. Yet the whispers followed him. Being both feared and scrutinized, he walked a knife's edge. His sexual orientation was a secret weapon and a potential death sentence. Allies could protect him one day, but the next, internal rivalries or ideological purists, could use the same fact to destroy him. In the SA, where loyalty often ended in blood, survival required both cunning and cruelty. Every public act of violence strengthened his position, but every secret also left him exposed. By the spring of 1933, Edmund Heines had cemented himself as a man whose presence alone commanded fear. After Hitler became chancellor on January 30, 1933, the SA was no longer just a paramilitary street force. They were now instruments of state authority. In Breslau, Heines was appointed police president, giving him both legal cover and almost unlimited power. Within weeks, he transformed his office into a hub of terror. He established a private detention center at Durgoy, where prisoners, often political opponents or those suspected of disloyalty, were subjected to beatings, humiliation, and worse. Eyewitnesses described screams echoing through the night, men beaten until they could barely stand, and interrogations where Heines personally took pleasure in inflicting pain. Reports from the local press, later archived in Silesian police records, hint at a man who combined bureaucratic precision with sadistic cruelty. Heines's reputation spread fast. Locals referred to him in whispers as the sadist of Breslau, and even some SA colleagues noted the unnerving mixture of charm and menace he carried. For Heines, torture was not just enforcement, it was performance, a display of absolute control that left both victims and bystanders in a state of terror. But unchecked brutality has consequences. The traditional German army, as well as conservative bureaucrats within the state, were uneasy with Heines's methods. While Hitler tolerated the SA's violence for political gains, the army and Reich officials saw men like Heines as destabilizing, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous to the new regime's long-term plans. Internal memos from the period show concern over the rogue elements in Breslau and the fear that such figures could provoke both domestic unrest and international attention. Meanwhile, Heines's personal style of rule in Breslau only deepened his notoriety. He rarely delegated enforcement, often appearing at his private camp to supervise interrogations personally. Prisoners who survived described a man who observed every detail, savoring fear as a tool of domination. It was a combination that made him indispensable to some Nazi leaders and intolerable to others. The tension between the need for ruthless enforcers and the risk they posed was becoming impossible to ignore. By mid-1933, Heines was at a crossroads. His power had grown beyond the streets, extending into the official machinery of the state, yet his enemies were watching, waiting for a slip, a scandal, or an excuse to remove him. The very qualities that had propelled him upward, aggression, cunning, and an unflinching capacity for cruelty, now marked him as both an asset and a threat. For a man who had survived war, paramilitary purges, and political scandal, the next challenge would not be external enemies, but the internal politics of a regime that tolerated terror only until it threatened control. And soon, that test would come in a place far from Breslau, where personal vendettas and state purges would collide. By 1934, the SA had grown from a street-fighting militia into a massive force of hundreds of thousands, far outnumbering the Reichswehr. Heines, now one of Ernst Röhm's closest deputies, was deeply involved in this swelling power structure. Together, they envisioned a Germany where the SA would not just enforce Nazi rule, but become the backbone of a new military order, potentially absorbing the army itself. For Heines, the dream was intoxicating. Absolute power sanctioned by loyalty, fear, and ruthlessness. But outside the SA, unease was growing. Generals in the Reichswehr, industrial leaders, and conservative politicians feared the SA's unchecked aggression. They saw men like Heines not as protectors of the state, but as wild predators whose loyalty to Röhm could override the loyalty owed to Hitler. Private correspondences from army officers in early 1934 describe SA leaders as untamed and dangerous, highlighting the growing tension between the old military order and this new paramilitary power. Within the SA, Heines continued to build his personal reputation. He supervised units in Berlin, Dresden, and Breslau, enforcing discipline with a mix of charisma and brutality. Witness statements from 1933 to 1934 mention him attending interrogations personally, overseeing beatings, and demonstrating a cold enjoyment in controlling those under his authority. Each act of violence increased his notoriety and his leverage within the SA hierarchy, yet also made him a target. The more powerful he became, the more enemies he acquired, both within the SA and beyond it. By mid-1934, whispers of a purge circulated quietly among party insiders. Hitler had begun receiving reports from conservative elites and army leaders warning that Röhm and his deputies, Heines included, were planning a coup or at least an unchecked expansion of the SA's power. The stakes were enormous. For Hitler, tolerating the SA's violence was one thing. Allowing them to challenge his authority was another. Heines, ever confident, did not see the storm approaching. He moved freely between SA offices and his private sphere of influence, unconcerned with the subtle machinations of generals, industrialists, and political rivals. His focus remained on loyalty to Röhm and the expansion of the SA's reach. But in the shadows, a deadly plan was taking shape, one that would erase decades of ambition in a single, violent night. By late June 1934, the hotel at Bad Wiessee was buzzing with activity that outsiders might have mistaken for a normal retreat. High-ranking SA leaders arrived from Munich, Berlin, and beyond, carrying briefcases, uniforms, and the quiet tension of men accustomed to wielding power. Heines, already notorious for his brutality and close association with Röhm, stepped off his train with the confidence of someone used to command. He expected camaraderie, reports of shared strategy, and the kind of planning sessions that had always reinforced his status within the SA. Yet beneath the surface, the atmosphere was different. SS intelligence had circulated lists of men marked for elimination, and Heines' name appeared alongside others whose loyalty was now considered expendable. These lists, meticulously compiled from surveillance reports and internal tips, were intended to remove anyone who might challenge Hitler's control. For the first time, even a man of Heines's reputation faced uncertainty about who could be trusted. The corridors of the resort were filled with murmurs and half-smiles, subtle glances that hinted at suspicion. Other SA leaders, aware of the undercurrents, approached meetings with caution, avoiding eye contact or using coded phrases. Heines, despite his usual bravado, noted the change in tone. The tension was palpable, even before the official agenda began. He would later recall, according to SS archives, that small gestures, doors closing too quickly, whispered conversations, felt different this morning. In the rooms designated for discussions, arrangements were made for meals, schedules, and presentations. Yet each plan, each handshake, carried a shadow. Intelligence reports prepared by Heinrich Himmler's SS indicated who was likely to resist or be deemed too dangerous, and Heine's position on the list was no secret to a few select insiders. His mind, trained to anticipate threats, registered the subtle signals of danger, even if the full scope remained unclear. Guests moved through the halls, some laughing lightly, others with faces drained of color. Observers later described the air as thick with expectancy, a strange mix of normalcy and fear. Heines, experienced in navigating both street-level violence and political intrigue, felt a twinge of caution, a rare moment for someone used to dominance. He knew alliances were fragile, and in the world of the SA, the same hand that rewarded could just as quickly strike. The sun would rise over Bad Wiessee, illuminating the lake and the alpine slopes, but inside, hidden decisions were being made. The purge was imminent, and Heines's personal moment, where reputation, loyalty, and power would collide, was about to become history. The morning of June 30th, 1934, began quietly in the Bavarian Alps, with the lake reflecting a calm sky and the distant peaks glowing in the first sunlight. Yet inside the hotel at Bad Wiessee, the calm was a fragile mask over tension that could snap at any moment. Men who had once wielded unchecked authority now moved cautiously, aware that a single glance or word could mark them for death. The purge, meticulously planned by Hitler and the SS, was about to erase the autonomy of the SA in one decisive stroke. Edmund Heines, who had risen from war-torn Munich streets to the apex of SA power, was caught in this storm. He had survived battlefield chaos, Freikorps violence, court trials, and political rivalries, relying on brutality and cunning to cement his influence. But this morning, no previous victories could protect him. Intelligence gathered by Heinrich Himmler's SS had identified him as a threat not only because of his closeness to Ernst Röhm, but also due to the whispers about his personal life. Hitler's fury, fueled by perceived betrayal and the need to consolidate power, would allow no exceptions. Heines was discovered in his room, in bed, with his 20-year-old driver, Erich Schiebeck. The scene, scandalous even by the covertly permissive standards of SA leadership, was the final straw. SS officers entered swiftly, silent, but for the sound of boots on polished floors. Hitler's order was clear: give the men 5 minutes to dress, or face immediate execution. Heines, defiant to the end, refused. His loyalty to his own sense of invincibility outweighed the instinct for survival. Schiewek mirrored his defiance. The SS wasted no time. In a cold, calculated execution, bullets tore through the hotel room. The report from SS archives would later note that the execution was precise, intended to leave no question about who was in control. The sound of gunfire echoed across the halls, a brutal punctuation to decades of violence and ambition. Other SA leaders, either arrested or killed in their rooms, would meet similar fates. By midday, the SA's independence was shattered. The streets they had once controlled with terror now belonged to the SS. Outside, the Bavarian sun continued to climb, oblivious to the horrors occurring within the hotel. For those on the ground, the transformation of Nazi power was immediate and chilling. Heines, who had once been feared for personally torturing enemies, enforcing concentration, and manipulating both loyalty and fear, was now reduced to a name on a purge list. The regime had proven that no amount of violence or notoriety could protect even the most ruthless enforcers from the state itself. With Heines gone and the SA effectively broken, the SS emerged as the uncontested enforcer of Hitler's vision, but the shadows of fear, betrayal, and scandal would continue to shape the Third Reich in ways no one fully anticipated. After Heines and his inner circle were executed, the Nazi regime moved quickly to control the narrative. Newspapers and radio reports painted the purge as a moral crusade. Heines, once feared for personally torturing prisoners and enforcing terror, was now described as a symbol of corruption and moral degeneracy within the SA. The regime emphasized his sexuality, linking it directly to the chaos and rebellion within the party. Propaganda ministers, including Joseph Goebbels, ensured that the story framed the purge as not only politically necessary, but morally justified. In doing so, Heines's violent reputation was overshadowed by scandal, turning him into an object lesson rather than a figure of fear. The official story was simple and neat. The SA had grown too powerful, too uncontrollable, and too immoral. Heines, as Röhm's close associate, and as a man whose private life contradicted Nazi ideology, became the perfect scapegoat. Posters, pamphlets, and speeches emphasized that the purge had cleansed the party of its vices, painting Hitler as the ultimate arbiter of justice. Yet insiders knew that the reasons were more complex. Heine's brutality and influence had long posed a threat to the balance of power within the Nazi hierarchy. The narrative of sexual immorality was convenient, turning whispers and private knowledge into public justification for political murder. Historians today note that while Heine's homosexuality was real, its emphasis in propaganda was selective. The regime exploited private details to sanitize a violent power struggle, obscuring the political stakes behind a moralistic lens. As one SS archive report from July 1934 stated, Heines's execution was a decisive blow against corruption and moral decay, even as it conveniently erased the fear he had inspired in those around him. Survivors of the SA were left with a dual legacy: terror from the violence Heines had commanded, and shame and confusion from the way his life was recast after death. The ripple effects of his cruelty continued. Former prisoners and those he had tortured quietly remembered him, while the SS consolidated authority, learning from the efficiency of the purge. Heine's story became a warning. Even the most loyal enforcer, even a man who had executed and terrorized without hesitation, could be erased when the state decided it. His past acts of violence were forgotten in public discourse, replaced by a sanitized tale of immorality, ensuring that the moral panic served the political purpose of consolidating SS power. In the months after the purge, the SA's decline was unmistakable. Members either fled, were absorbed into other units, or vanished quietly under the radar. The fear Heines had once inspired was redirected toward the SS. And in private, party members whispered not about the morality of the purge, but about who might be next. The shadow of vengeance, power, and betrayal stretched across the regime, leaving no one certain of their survival. With Heines' death recast as moral cleansing, the Third Reich moved forward, but the methods, violence, and terror he perfected would echo through the SS and the state, shaping the machinery of control that would soon engulf Germany entirely. In Breslau, the streets slowly returned to a tense calm. Residents who had lived under Heines's private concentration camp and his unpredictable terror finally felt a sense of relief, though it was uneasy. Shops reopened, the police acted with a different restraint, and the ordinary rhythm of life returned. But memories of the beatings, disappearances, and arbitrary arrests lingered. Those who had survived whispered about the man who had ruled the city with fear, as if the mere mention of his name could summon the past. Heines's brother Oscar, also prominent in the SA, had not survived the purge either. The decapitation of the SA left the organization leaderless and vulnerable. What had once seemed an unstoppable paramilitary force now appeared fractured and exposed. Hitler, having removed the radical threat, sent a clear message. Loyalty was conditional, and even the most violent enforcers could be eliminated if they threatened the state's balance. The army, once wary of the SA's growing power, now pledged obedience, reassured that their rivals had been silenced in the night. Despite the purge, Heines's methods, the torture, intimidation, and use of terror as a tool of obedience, did not vanish. In Breslau, former subordinates adapted his techniques to maintain control under the new hierarchy, applying lessons learned from fear to the SS and local police structures. In many ways, the purge created a template. Absolute power could be enforced through swift, brutal punishment, and the public narrative could be manipulated to justify it. What had begun as personal cruelty now became institutionalized. The psychological impact on the population was profound. Citizens internalized fear as a method of survival. Those who had once cowered under Heines now lived in a world where terror was no longer personal, but systematic. Surveillance, arbitrary arrests, and the threat of sudden punishment became normalized. In schools, factories, and neighborhoods, the shadow of Heines's brutality lingered, even if his name was sanitized or vilified by official propaganda. Historians like Richard Evans note that these purges, while political, also cemented a culture of fear in Germany, one that would spread far beyond Breslau. The fall of Heines also reinforced the SS's role as the ultimate enforcers of Hitler's vision. What had been the SA's strength, the ability to act with impunity, was now monopolized by a smaller, more disciplined organization. This consolidation of terror allowed the Nazi state to expand its control efficiently, learning from Heines's previous methods while avoiding the internal instability that had plagued the SA. Heines was dead, his brother gone, and the SA crushed. But the mechanisms of cruelty and obedience he honed were now in the hands of others. Even years after his death, Heines remained a figure both feared and studied by those who survived him. Contemporaries recalled the strange contradictions in his appearance and behavior. One survivor described him as having a girlish face on the body of a truck driver, a mixture of charm and menace that made his violence even more unpredictable. Others remembered the meticulous cruelty he applied in Breslau, how prisoners could be broken with a look, a threat, or the simple touch of his hand in the interrogation room. Historians like Ian Kershaw have noted that Heines' life illustrates a broader pattern in Nazi Germany. The state often promoted men who were capable of extreme brutality, only to later turn on them when their independence or notoriety threatened central control. The use of Heines' homosexuality as a tool for propaganda shows how the regime could recast reality to suit its political aims. Paragraph 175 was cited not to enforce law, but to delegitimize the SA's radical wing and justify the purge. His prior conviction for murder in the Stettin trial was selectively highlighted to demonstrate moral decay, even though many SA leaders had similar or worse histories. His life and death became a lesson. Loyalty could protect, brutality could elevate, but ultimately, no one was untouchable under Hitler's system. The brutality he had perfected, intimidation, torture, and extrajudicial punishment, did not die with him. SS leaders who observed the purge absorbed the methods and applied them in concentration camps, police operations, and political suppression. In essence, Heines's techniques became standardized tools for maintaining order through fear. What had once been his personal signature of violence became institutionalized, ensuring that his influence extended far beyond his physical presence. Heine's story also forces reflection on how regimes manipulate both truth and memory. He was vilified as a degenerate to justify a political consolidation, yet in private, his skills were admired and studied. His life raises a question that historians continue to debate. When does a state turn its enforcers into victims, and what does that say about the system itself? In the case of the SA purge, the answer is chillingly clear. Personal vices, loyalty, and brutal skill were no protection when they became inconvenient to those in power. In one sense, Heines was a symptom. The disease was the Nazi state itself. The mechanisms he perfected, the culture of fear he embodied, and the propaganda that consumed him would continue to shape Germany for years. And the question remained, who would next pay the price for the machinery he helped build? The execution of Edmund Heines in June 1934 was not simply the removal of one man. It was a signal that the Third Reich was entering a new phase of internal control. Heines had been both a tool and a threat. An enforcer whose brutality served Hitler's rise, but whose independence and notoriety could no longer be tolerated. His death, alongside the purge of other SA leaders, marked a dramatic pivot. Loyalty to a single figure, Hitler, was now the only shield against the state's machinery of terror. For ordinary Germans, and even for the military, the lesson was clear. Power rested not in rank or reputation, but in absolute alignment with the Führer's will. The SA had begun as a paramilitary extension of the party, a street-fighting gang that enforced Nazi ideology through intimidation and violence. Under Heines, their reach extended into every corner of Berlin and Breslau, where his personal style of terror was a combination of spectacle and calculated cruelty. After his death, the SS absorbed this same ethos, refining it into an organized, disciplined, and bureaucratically controlled force. The spontaneous violence of the SA became systematized, directed not by the whims of individuals, but by a centralized state apparatus. Heine's personal methods, threats, torture, and the terrorization of both enemies and civilians became templates for institutions that would soon administer the Holocaust and police the Reich. Heines's trajectory, from war hero to Freikorps fighter, from SA enforcer to police chief, and ultimately to executed target, also illustrates a chilling principle. In totalitarian systems, even the enforcers are expendable. Each step in his rise was facilitated by chaos, disorder, and the use of violence as a currency of power. Each step in his fall was orchestrated by the same system, proving that the rules of loyalty, brutality, and reputation are fluid when the stakes involve survival at the top. His life and death remind us that in a regime built on fear, personal ambition can carry one only so far. The structures of terror themselves are the ultimate arbiters. Modern historians point to the purge of Heines and the SA as an early example of how regimes consolidate power through controlled violence. When Hitler moved against Heines, it was not moral judgment that dictated the action, but strategy, removing a potentially destabilizing force and sending a clear signal to allies and rivals alike. The process was surgical, targeted, and justified publicly through propaganda that framed the purge as a moral cleansing. By recasting Heines's personal life and criminal record, the Nazis created a narrative that masked political calculation with moral outrage. The lesson resonates beyond 1934. Regimes often manipulate stories, reputations, and legal structures to strengthen central control, turning fear into obedience and chaos into order. Heine's story also serves as a warning about the human cost of institutionalized violence. The victims of his camps in Breslau, the political rivals he intimidated in Berlin, and the colleagues who would later face purges all illustrate how a single individual's methods, when integrated into a larger system, can have consequences that outlive the person. The apparatus he helped refine, the machinery of surveillance, terror, and extrajudicial punishment, did not end with his death. On the contrary, his techniques became embedded in the institutions that enforced Nazi rule, demonstrating how systems can outlast the men who create them. The man may be gone, but the method lives on. The question remains: when history repeats the consolidation of power through fear, who is next? And how do societies resist the machinery that once elevated and destroyed Edmund Heines? For a brief, shocking moment in 1934, Edmund Heines, the enforcer who had ruled with fear, found himself at the mercy of the very system he helped strengthen. His death in Bad Wiessee didn't just end a life. It marked a turning point, showing how the Nazi state could take violence in-house and use it with ruthless efficiency. From decorated soldier to feared SA leader, Heines's rise and fall reveal how loyalty and brutality could propel a man upward, then destroy him without warning. If Heines's life and death showed the deadly logic of power within the Nazi regime, the story didn't end there. In our next video, we'll follow the SS after the war, how they survived, adapted, and carried the machinery of terror forward long after the Nazis' empire was gone.